A one-time Florida Gator football star and teammate of Aaron Hernandez accepts a plea deal in his girlfriend's murder. This after the case went cold for years and was only cracked open with the help of a true crime cold case documentary. Those two facts combined make it an unusual case. 37-year-old Earl Tony Joyner, who rose to fame as a University of Florida safety from 2004 to 2007, is now accused of killing 26-year-old Hayzel Obando in her Fort Myers, Florida apartment more than 7 years ago. Joyner, in his 2007 senior year, played alongside Aaron Hernandez, the former NFL star who would become a convicted murderer and acquitted of another before killing himself in prison. Similar to Hernandez, years after living that Florida Gator football life, Joyner's life took a shocking turn when in 2019 he was charged with Obando's murder. Joyner called 911 on February 14, 2016 to report he found Obando, the mother of his two daughters, covered in blood in her apartment. But the charges against the former Florida Gator didn't come until 3 years later. Former Florida prosecutor Melba Pearson tells us it's relatively normal for an arrest to be made in a cold case.
That is not normal. But that's not a bad thing per se, right?
But it's unusual for a true crime documentary team to assist in the investigation.
Having shows like Cold Justice and others that come in and help local police departments, or even we've seen shows that address wholesale issues.
According to court documents, Joyner seemed cold and emotionless when investigators arrived on the scene of Obando's murder. He sat completely silent for hours as the crime scene was being investigated. An affidavit states that the daughters Joyner and Obando shared were outside in a car when he called 911. The court docs allege one of the girls may have witnessed their mother's murder because she told a nurse who examined her, quote, "Poppy shooted mommy." Even so, the case went cold in the years following Obando's murder.
Sometimes at the time when a homicide occurs, there are a number of different reasons where people don't come forward. They may not come forward because they're afraid, or they weren't sure that they saw what they thought they saw. It was the middle of the night, it was kind of blurry out, or they didn't have their glasses on, or whatever the case may be. But then sometimes upon reflection over the course of a few years, you may realize, wow, I saw something that was significant. And then if you're approached at that time, you give an honest answer as to what occurred. Also, you have the fact that people may move away, right? So they may have felt intimidated to testify against someone that lives on the same block as them, and that they may face retaliation from family members of the defendant or something along those lines. Now they've moved away and they feel more comfortable to be able to give evidence against the person, right? So there's a number of different reasons why cases go cold and then get more steam years later.
But in 2019, the Oxygen TV network's Cold Justice team took on the case.
The activity happened right in this area. She would have been facing the doorway.
And the shooter would have been in this general area, and we know that from the location of Hayzel's body.
With the assistance of Cold Justice investigators, new photo evidence was recovered in the case, showing pictures of a man holding a gun. Detectives determined the weapon was a 9mm semi-automatic handgun and traced the weapon back to its original owner. They told police the weapon was purchased in October 2015 and unused before it was sold to Joyner the following year. The witness also identified Joyner as the man in the picture. Joyner was later arrested and charged with second-degree murder with a firearm. Pearson says the Cold Justice team likely helped move the investigation forward and yield an arrest.
I think that it's a combination of a few things why these cold case teams can be so effective. The ones from externally coming from the media space. Number one, they're approaching the case with a fresh set of eyes, right? They're not coming in with any preconceived notions or maybe even history necessarily of the area, of the people involved, or anything like that. So that fresh perspective can be very helpful in identifying, hey, maybe you need to re-interview so-and-so, or did you notice this one tip that came in? Because again, if you have a homicide that is covered on the local media or something along those lines, the department may be getting 100 tips 200 tips. Somebody's got to sit down and read through each one of them and decide whether this goes into the pile of we definitely need to follow up, or if we have time, we'll try and talk to the person, or we don't think that this holds any significance. So it's possible that a cold case team could come in and say, listen, here's something that was overlooked, and be able to use that to help push the case forward. So I think there's a positive there, as well as just, the fact that many departments are overwhelmed and don't have the person power to be able to really take on these cases and follow up. So they're bringing a fresh perspective, and they're bringing more person power.
Pearson says the delay in Joyner's arrest is a relatively common occurrence.
But a lot of times what happens, again, knowing that time is never really your friend when it comes to prosecuting these types of cases, the reality is that sometimes the lead detective that worked on the case may have retired or passed away. Or you could have a situation where key witnesses or key evidence, just either wasn't found or isn't sufficient to be able to bring this case forward. Now, you may have enough to file, but the reality is you have to think about, can I prove this case beyond and to the exclusion of all reasonable doubt? And with that time frame being an issue, sometimes it's better just to take a plea or to offer a plea so that you can give the family closure, the defendant is held accountable for their actions, and everyone can kind of move on from that point.
Now, years after his arrest, Joyner has reached a plea deal in the case. Pearson explains there are many different possibilities for how the deal was reached.
Basically, the behind the scenes with regards to a plea agreement is that either party can make the first approach. So it could be the defense reaching out to the prosecution saying, listen, I've reviewed this case, I've talked to my client is willing to accept X, 20 years, 25 years, knowing that he was charged with second-degree murder, which is with a firearm, which is an offense punishable by life. Seeing a plea agreement in the range of 20 to 30 years wouldn't be outside the norm. So it could be that the defense attorney approached the prosecution, or the prosecution may have initiated the discussion to say, listen, if there's a number you're thinking about, let me know so that I can go back to the next of kin, the family members of the victim, and make sure that they're okay with this number as well. And so there'll be discussion back and forth. There would be negotiations between the prosecutor that's handling the case and the defense counsel. And then finally, they come to an agreement, which they have not revealed what the final amount is because of the fact that the judge still needs to ratify it. And there's, again, a lot of moving parts that are in play until the defendant actually raises his hand and swears that he's going to tell the truth and then accept this plea and accept responsibility for what happened.
A hearing is set for next month where both sides will officially present the plea deal to a judge.
He will come with his counsel. Him and his counsel and the prosecutor will present the plea agreement to the judge. The judge has the option of ratifying it, being like, listen, this sounds appropriate based on reading the arrest affidavit, reading whatever information is available about the case. The judge can say, all right, this is acceptable. Or the judge could be like, you know what? I'm not going to put my name to this. I'm not going to sign off on this. The two parties will have to come to a different arrangement. Or the judge may encourage the defendant to plea open to the court if they know that there's another outcome that they want to see happen, they being the judge.
But according to Pearson, a plea deal doesn't necessarily mean admittance of guilt from Joyner. It also means we may never know what happened the night Obando was murdered. So
at the plea hearing in June, he is going to probably again raise his right hand and say that he's going to answer the judge's questions truthfully, and the judge is going to ask questions around, do you understand the charges against you? Do you understand that the case ends today, that there's not going to be a trial, there's not going to be an opportunity for appeal, making sure that you're understanding the rights that you're waiving. So they'll go through an entire colloquy, and then the defendant will say, yes, I understand, or no, I don't have any questions, whatever the case may be. And then the judge will say, are you pleading guilty because you are in fact guilty, or are you pleading guilty because you're doing so out of convenience? And then the answer is usually a one-word yes. So you're never going to really hear the defendant come out and say, on X date, I, killed my ex-girlfriend, and, this was my motivation why. We may never know. We can assume, based on the evidence that has been revealed to this point, that this was a domestic violence relationship, that they've had a volatile relationship. We can probably assume that this was a jealousy type situation, or she was trying to leave or something along those lines. But we may never know the full truth of everything that happened, unfortunately.
Had Joyner's case headed to trial, Pearson says a possible defense could reference CTE, or even the case of his former teammate, Aaron Hernandez.
So in terms of the fact that both the defendant and Aaron Hernandez played together and sadly went down the same path, I think that speaks to, and I'm going to go out on a limb here, I think that speaks a lot to CTE and all of the studies that are now coming out around the brain and the fragility of the brain, especially in terms of having these high contact sports like football. And, we're seeing all of these, CAT scans and, brain scans from retired players who you're just like, how did you even function? Right. So I think there's something to be said when you think about the fact that sometimes football players are playing from pee-wees, so from age 10, and now you're 20 something years old and have had repeated trauma to your brain over and over again, especially during your formative years, right? Because again, your brain is still developing, your skull doesn't fully harden until a certain point in your life. Again, I'm not a doctor, but just again, based on what I've read around this topic, that repeated trauma to your head can cause behavioral problems, can cause, cognitive problems. So, that's not to absolve him of what he did. But I think, again, we need, as Americans, we need to be like, as much as we love this sport, what is it really doing to people, and what is it really doing to our society? And how these athletes are putting their bodies on the line for our entertainment, what cost is okay for us? Is it going to be at the cost of collateral damage to their friends, family, loved ones? I don't know if it's worth it. So those are just things that we're going to have to examine more deeply as a society, what price of entertainment we're willing to really pay.
Prior to Obando's murder, she and Joyner were involved in 2 prior domestic violence incidents. In one case, Joyner allegedly hit Obando at a mall during an argument. In a separate incident, he hit her in the forehead with a bat, causing a bump and swelling.
The underlying issue in this case appears to be domestic violence. So this is just another reminder that domestic violence is not something that we've conquered, that has gone away. There are still, millions and millions of people in this country and all around the world suffering in silence. So it's just on all of us to remember that, there are people suffering, and if we see something, we need to say something, and we need to speak up and not let this be this quiet shame that it used to be in decades past.
In the end, Pearson says the involvement of cold case teams in older cases could lead to more closure for victims' families.
So while this is not the norm, I hope that more of these shows take an interest and are able to bring closure to more families, because at the end of the day, that's what this needs to be about justice and making sure that people have closure.
Following Obando's murder, her mother was granted permanent custody of the 2 daughters she shared with Joyner. Joyner is due back in court on June 5th for a hearing. Reporting for Law&Crime Network, I'm Sierra Gillespie.